Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 32 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, this series, we've been looking at the revised and expanded edition of Tolkien's Letters, edited by Humphrey Carpenter and Christopher Tolkien. It's time to keep going as I share and discuss some of the new content found only in this new edition of the volume. Now, last week, we looked at 3 letters to Christopher Tolkien written between October 1940 and January 1941, including a little bit of talk about the blackouts of World War II, Christopher's need for pocket money, and Professor Tolkien's advice about not forgetting your mom's birthday. Now, this week, we'll look at some letters to both Christopher and Michael. Again, these are each letters that are only found in the revised and expanded edition of the Letters volume. We're going to start with letter 42C, written to Christopher just 3 weeks after the very short letter 42B that we read at the end of last week's Tolkien Tuesday. There, Tolkien said he'd been very busy, but will write again later. And here we have it. The professor starts by admitting he's not done a great job of giving his son attention, saying that he's rather neglected Christopher thanks to his duties. He goes on to say that his last time out, socially, was the previous Thursday, 10 days before. It wasn't a great success, Tolkien says, and then he goes on to mention a couple of other inklings that were at one of their gatherings. Bear with me as I read, and I'll explain when I'm done with the rest of the paragraph. It was rather a failure, as Warnie Lewis, the gallant major, depends on Havard, honest Humphrey, or the noble doctor, to take him home. But Havard did not arrive. When the major discovered by phone that he was not coming, and he had got to leave the meeting for the last bus at 9:30, or walk, he changed the title and spoke of honest Humphrey as a useless quack. Useless quack will certainly be adopted. Well, first, the easy one that most of you already know about, Warnie Lewis. That's Major Warren H. Lewis, the brother of C.S. Lewis, and one of the founding members of the Inklings. But who is this Havard fellow, apparently also known as honest Humphrey, the noble doctor, and soon to be known as useless quack? Well, you might be surprised to know his name wasn't Humphrey, actually. This was Dr. Robert Havard, an Oxford-schooled physician who was C.S. Lewis's doctor before Lewis had introduced him to the Inklings a couple of years earlier. Hugo Dyson had been unable to remember Dr. Havard's given name of Robert and instead gave him the nickname Humphrey. Humphrey eventually also became the Tolkien family doctor and a family friend who frequented the Inklings' Thursday pub visits, and it seems was also Warnie's ride this past week. Now, a bit more on honest Humphrey. He was eventually called up to serve as a medical officer in the Royal Navy, and when he came back while on leave, sported a full red beard, giving him yet another nickname among the Inklings, the Red Admiral. He was, of course, far from useless. He was a specialist in biochemistry, published more than 24 papers in various medical journals. Later in his life, he and Tolkien were neighbors. By that time, Havard was a widower with 5 children, one of whom was actually Tolkien's godson. Now back to letter 42C. Tolkien tells Christopher that he and Michael had gone to St. Gregory's that morning, but that also hadn't gone all that well. Tolkien described it as very much running to seed after the departure of the former parish priest, and the priest that day, who Tolkien surmised was Irish-American, roared through the Mass with a bull-like voice, incapable of articulating any Latin word recognizably. Now, I'm skipping letter 43 to Michael. There is some new content, but it is a very long letter that itself would require much of an entire 8-week series to dissect, and I don't think I'm up to the task, as it has a few, shall we say, different views on men, women, and marriage than many of us would be comfortable with today. It is worth reading, but I won't be doing it here. Letter 43A, though, is also to Michael, written just a few days after letter 43. And in it, Tolkien offers some more interesting advice about how to handle certain conflicts with women in his life. One word of really sound advice, not any the easier to take for that: get in straight and keep there with lover, fiancé, wife. Quite apart from love, there are many things that a man feels are legitimate, even though they cause a fuss. Let him not lie about them to his wife or lover. Cut them out. Or, if worth a fight, fight. Just insist. A little fuss early saves a mort, which means a great deal, of trouble later. Such matters do not usually arise until at least a formal engagement. Then each side has a certain claim. Then they may arise frequently. The glass of beer, the pipe, the non-writing of letters, the other friend, etc., etc. If the other side's claims really are unreasonable, as they are at times between the dearest lovers and most loving married folk, they are much better met by above-board refusal and fuss than subterfuge. Either cut them out or insist, but deal with it early and openly. I can get on board with that. Certainly better than lying about them or, as he says at the end, subterfuge. Of course, that advice cuts both ways, I would add, and I hope that he'd give this advice to Priscilla as well. Now, we skip from March 1941 to the summer of 1943 and letter 49A, an entirely new letter to this volume written to Christopher. He was 18 at this point, and he'd been called up to the Royal Air Force. In fact, he was at this time in London at the Air Crew Receiving Center. Tolkien feels for the fact that just as Christopher has gotten into uniform, summer has properly arrived. After all, he says, I joined up within 3 weeks of going down in blazing July weather in 1915, so I profoundly sympathize. He also helps Christopher put some perspective to his military service, saying that if it is any support to know this, you are doing it for us. There are too many abstract words and isms in the world today, and one may find patriotism and even duty fail when love of one's own folk will endure. And that makes me think of Frodo. He didn't agree to take the ring out of a sense of patriotism for the Shire, or even duty, though he did clearly feel great responsibility. He did it for love of one's own folk. Tolkien talks about having slept in on Sunday as well, but still managing to get to St. Gregory's, where it seems the previous priest, a Father Carter, had returned. As Tolkien says, he was excellent. He gave an admirably restrained talk on Rome in the notices, and then an admirable sermon on the gospel, and yet we were out in an hour. I expect we may now go back there occasionally. And then he offers Christopher a little health-related advice as well. Poor lad, inoculation can be beastly. I, like you, had never been vaccinated, and it took like fury when I was done. For safety's sake, I hope they will vaccinate you. If and when they do, take all care you can. Don't risk a chill, and don't do anything more than you must. I, like a fool, pushed off on leave, and consequently was really ill with an astronomical temperature. The war continued to have an impact, as he asked Christopher if he'd had an alert on Monday night, as the southeast sky was lit with distant flashes like sheet lightning for an hour after I had got back to bed. And folks, that wraps it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week as we take a look at more letters to Christopher, including, if time allows, Tolkien sending him his pipe. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, a bonus weekly episode, and more. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, you know the drill by now. Like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. And please follow or subscribe on your podcast apps. Follow @Tolkien Times on social media, and as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.